evening. Welcome and thank you all for coming here this evening. Can you hear me? Oh, a little louder. Well, I can't speak much louder, but is this any better? Yes. Good, thank you. Again, welcome. Thank you for coming. It is sadly becoming commonplace when we gather for a thoughtful, sober discussion of public issues, especially today's topic of white nationalism, that the reality of the topic intrudes emotionally upon our lives. The ugly face of hatred has once again expressed itself in yet another synagogue killing, as it has too many times, too recently, in African-American church killings, mosque killings, both here in the United States and around the world. We're offended and outraged at the perpetrators of such hatred. We're saddened at the deaths and injuries of people who were gathered in that most innocent of activities, prayer, and we are scared, thinking that we might be the next targets. We look for comfort to our friends, colleagues, congregants, rabbis, imams, priests, and ministers, and we hope that time and companionship will heal us, though the memories will never completely go away. Rabbi Eliana of Temple B'nai B'rith, who has just returned on a long flight from Israel, had hoped to be here this evening to offer some words of comfort for all of us mourning victims of violent hatred. In her absence, perhaps a few moments of silence might allow each of us to gather our own thoughts and feelings. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. My name is Fred Levy. I'm president of Temple B'nai B'rith, and so pleased to be here tonight. Of course, even without the recent horrors, we at Temple B'nai B'rith and in Somerville would be opposed to any movement that would advance a single group of people distinguished only by their so-called race or their religion above all others. We do not want to live in a society where such movements cannot be called out for what they are: hateful, bigoted, and dangerous. Temple B'nai B'rith's Social Action Committee initially put together this program in January, but it was still too close to the murders at the Pittsburgh synagogue, and frankly, we did not feel safe holding it even at that time. However, with the gracious co-sponsorship of the Somerville Human Rights Commission, we're now able to present this important event. Eldon Rosenthal of the Southern Poverty Law Center and Stephen Gardner of Political Research Associates here in Somerville have been most gracious, agreeing to come to our community and to educate and perhaps mobilize us in the face of this clear and present, but too much unrecognized danger. I'd also like to thank our other co-sponsors and those who have been instrumental in making this happen: Temple Shir Tikva of Winchester and Rabbi Carrie Birkeland Small and Robin Kuttner, Karim El Razaz, the Community Projects Manager of the Islamic Society of Boston, and Imam Waris for their support, Temple Isaiah of Lexington, Chief David Fallon of the Somerville Police Department, who's been extraordinarily supportive, understanding, and helpful in working with us to navigate our security concerns. And last but definitely not least, our next speaker, Mayor Curtatone, who has put the resources of our city firmly behind our search for peace, safety, inclusiveness, and equality.
Thank you, Fred. Good evening. On behalf of the city, just personally, I want to thank Rabbi Eliana, the Southern Poverty Law Center of the Temple B'nai B'rith community, and really Somerville as a community, because every day I'm charged up by what we fight for in this community, which I think we'd all be embracing what the true values of our country is, a community that believes we should continue to strive to be a country that is diverse, that is tolerant, that doesn't treat our fellow man as less human or worth less than any one of us. And every day I feel responses of anger and confusion as to how are we getting here? What is going on? I think there's a few lessons in history that remind us that the work we're doing now, how we come together, how we respond, is critical. First, my deepest sympathies and sorrow for those in the latest act of victims and survivors of the latest act of violence on Shabbat Poway in California and the mosque. It's something that's becoming too commonplace, and we're quick to respond to the means used to commit these horrific acts, but we have to squarely recognize and be very blunt that we have the rhetoric coming out of our leadership in Washington, fueled by racism, fueled by white supremacy, has given license that has revealed this hatred in our country and is being played out around the world. The topic tonight, a response to white nationalism, is critical, but the rule of law is also important. I learned in my study of the law and history, we have seen over time, and we know this, and the Jewish community knows this very well, and the world knows what happened in the Holocaust, when you have laws or rules without order, fueled by values that undermine human values, tragedy, genocide, human suffering occurs. And we're seeing that here in the place we never thought we'd see it. Right here in the center and the beacons of democracy, where our institutions built up by champions for human rights, those who fought against human suffering, those who fought for inclusiveness and equality, continue to do so today, that are being undercut by the people elected to represent all of us. That cannot stand. That just cannot stand. And I ask myself every day, what should I be doing in my role that I'm charged and privileged to hold in this community? And every day I try to follow what you're doing here. I try to double down on our communities and our human values. I try to lead in what we fight for in Somerville every day. I try to embrace my fellow human being, my fellow man, and my neighbors with the same compassion that welcomed my family here to this country. And no matter where we are, where we come from, or who we are, or what we represent, we cannot lose sight of those values. We have to double down on who we are. I do believe our faith, our collective values, and our collective compassion will overcome this hatred. It may be suffering along the way, but we cannot be deterred by it. I thank you for coming out today. I thank you for all the work you've done in the city. There are people out in this audience that work every day and speak out every day about what's happening, not just around the country, around the world, but even in our community. When we see acts of even hatred in our neighborhoods and our school, people have to speak up. That happens here. Those stories have to be told. We have to confront it straight on, not with hatred, but with love and compassion in our values. And we cannot be tolerant till any of this festers. It can never be brushed aside. I thank you for your work. I thank you for what you charge me to do every day. On behalf of the city, I want to introduce Nancy Solomon and thank her and the Human Rights Commission for their leadership and all our collective efforts. God bless.
And thank you to Temple B'nai B'rith for allowing us to be part of this very important conversation. I also want to acknowledge the work of other human rights commissioners that are in the room. We have Amy Henson, Michael Henson, and Rachel Schwartz who helped us with this event. And thank you all for being here. I want to start us off today by introducing our speakers. We're very lucky to have them. So first I want to introduce Eldon Rosenthal. Eldon Rosenthal is a Portland, Oregon lawyer who earned his bachelor's degree from UCLA and then his JD from Stanford Law School. During his legal career, Eldon's peers and colleagues honored him with the most prestigious awards given out by the Oregon State Bar, the Oregon Trial Lawyers Association, and the American Civil Liberties Union of Oregon. Since 2012, Eldon has served on the National Board of Directors of the Southern Poverty Law Center. In 1991, Eldon received national attention when he served as co-counsel with SPLC co-founder Morris Dees in a landmark case against the white Aryan resistance and its leaders. The defendants were accused of inciting racist skinheads to murder Mogeda Sarau, a black Ethiopian student living in Portland. After a 2-week trial, a jury ordered the defendants to pay the family $12.5 million in civil damages, a judgment that bankrupted the white Aryan resistance. Eldon was the first president of Congregation Elavat Shalom in Portland, a synagogue that has now over 400 families. He also served as an adjunct faculty member at Lewis and Clark Law School for 15 years, where he taught advanced tort law. He's an avid fly fisherman, skier, and baseball fan. Eldon and his wife, Margie, have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. 1 daughter, Deborah Shapira, and 2 grandchildren who live in Lexington. Thank you. Welcome, Eldon Rosenthal. Our second speaker is Stephen Gardner, who is the program area lead for the Racial and Immigrant Justice Program. He started researching and writing in opposition to the politics of bigotry, violence, and authoritarianism in the 1990s. Working from Portland, Oregon-based Coalition for Human Dignity, CHD, he did some of the first analysis of the religious right in the Northwest, and his work supported the years-long fight against anti-LGBTQ ballot measures of the Oregon Citizens Alliance. As editor of CHD's newsletter, The Dignity Report, and principal writer and analyst on the series of articles and reports, he helped to shape regional understanding of the armed resistance to anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, the patriot and militia movement, anti-immigrant xenophobia, and anti-LGBTQ politics. In 2004, Gardner received a PhD in cultural anthropology from Cornell University for his work on military masculinity and conscientious objection of the German military. Since earning his doctorate, he has taught more than 20 different courses at 8 universities in the United States, Pakistan, and the UAE. Selected publications include The Shadow of Service, Veteran Masculinity, and Civil Military Disjuncture in the United States, Behold the Man, Heroic Masochism, Military Christianity, and Mel Gibson's Passion, and White Nationalism Revisited, Demographic Dystopia and White Identity Politics. Thank you, Stephen. We're very lucky to have the both of you here with us today. Thank you. We'll now be starting our panel discussion.
Thank you so much for the. How's the sound? Is everyone hearing me? A little bit hot. All right. Is that good? Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Our program tonight, White Nationalism, Community Response, and the Rule of the Law. I have very special thanks for those who have sponsored and put this program together. First of all, for Temple B'nai B'rith of Somerville, the City of Somerville Human Rights Commission. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This could not be more timely, obviously. Also for other co-sponsors of the program, Temple Messiah of Lexington, Temple Shared Tikva, Winchester, First Church of Somerville, UCC, and the Islamic Society of Boston, ISU Cambridge. Thank you again. And at a personal level, I want to thank them for all of their work, the Social Action Committee of Congregation B'nai B'rith. All right, so yeah, I'm Stephen Gardner. I'm the program area lead and the Racial and Immigrant Justice Program at Political Research Associates, which is a hometown progressive think tank here in Somerville that does work nationally, that works to support movements that build a more inclusive and just society and to monitor, explain, and oppose organizations and ideologies that undermine human rights. My talk tonight, the first talk, is White Nationalism and the Violent Consequences of Anti-Semitic Bigotry. Given the events of the weekend just passed, And when there was yet another horrific attack on a synagogue by a politically motivated killer, it's hard to know where to start. I've done a lot of these talks, and it's been many years since I was standing in front of a crowd like this, a community-based crowd, immediately after one of these horrific incidents. I think a lot of us may be a little bit numb. That's the inevitable consequence of repeated traumas, and especially when we know that besides the violence, we're constantly exposed to hateful and bigoted language from mainstream media sources and from some of the highest leaders of our lands. So for those of us who've been following the far right of US political culture, and I've been doing that for over 30 years now, the recent developments are not so much shocking, but a matter of grave concern. Last fall, 48 hours before the shooter, the murderer who attacked the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Political Research Associates, my organization, was publishing a short article I wrote called "The Violent Consequences of Anti-Semitic Bigotry." In that article, I wrote the following words: while overt anti-Semitism was widely rejected in the post-World War II era because of its association with the Nazis, the most vulgar forms of Jew hatred lived on in neo-Nazi and other far-right circles and have proliferated in the internet era. So tonight, I'm going to try to, what I want to do is to walk you through a sort of a map. And it's a map of the relationship between the systemic forms of racism that continue to exist in this country that we refer to as the system of white supremacy, white nationalism as a social movement, the role of anti-Semitism within white nationalism, the relationship between white nationalism and the wider anti-Muslim and anti-migrant movements, and then finally suggests some possible community actions that you might want to consider. All right, so this is a conceptual map. It's about ideas, it's about movements, and it's about the relationships between leadership and action and politics and what motivates people. Of course, I'm only going to be touching on a few highlights tonight. It's important to understand that in 25 minutes that I'm going to be talking, there's just no way for me to cover everything. It's a giant topic, and this is mostly going to be focused on the situation in the United States. There's so much going on internationally. Even one part of this presentation could be a semester-long course at a university. But we have to start somewhere. So I like to start by talking about white supremacy as a system. Most of us, when we think about white supremacy, we probably think about something like this: Ku Klux Klan folk in hoods, burning a cross, terrorizing African Americans, preventing them from voting, probably in the South. This photo, in fact, is from 1956. It's from the Florida State Archives. I want you to, and people, and probably also with reference to, say, the old Jim Crow system, something like that. I want you to stop and consider for a minute that the system as it was built, the system of social inclusion and exclusion as it was built in the United States from the beginning, in its laws, in its customs, and in its practices and in its institutions, was a white supremacist system. I will also be saying that in some ways, it still is. It has obviously transformed. It is not the same white supremacist system. And then I'm going to talk about the relationship between that system and how that differs from what we at PRA, and I hope you, for our purposes tonight, will accept as I'm talking about as white nationalism. If you want to use other terms in other places, the words are not so important. But the point is that I'm talking about a relationship between an existing system with a long history and people who are actively working with the political program because they don't like it the way it is. Okay. Most of you may have learned this language in school at some point or another. Some of you may have legal training, but this is the language from the original Constitution, referred to as the Three-Fifths Compromise. It says, representatives in direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, meaning, of course, black folk, chattel slaves. That Three-Fifths Compromise was the basis for the inclusion of so-called slave and free states together. It was the basis for the apportionment of representation, and one of the compromises that led to a document that in its origins was always dealing with the problems of how to balance ideas of institutional and inclusive democracy with maintaining a set of racially organized rule by a group of white men. This was explicit in the documents at the time. This is not my sort of innovative interpretation. If you go back and you look at the people who argued these things out, they left voluminous records, and it's just completely clear this is what they were doing. This pertained all the way until after the Civil War, when that language was changed, and we ended up with the 13th Amendment ending slavery, and then the 14th Amendment finally, supposedly, theoretically, granting full citizenship to African Americans. And the 14th Amendment, for those of you who don't know the language, I'm going to read it to you because, in fact, it continues to be of central importance in understanding the demographics and who belongs in the United States. The Section 1 states, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So tonight we have a program that has a third title about the rule of law. Well, the 14th Amendment is the basis for full citizenship inclusion of everyone born in this country. It also includes strong reinforcement of the idea of due process of law. On the surface, this should have been a settled issue, but from the end of the Reconstruction period, courts and customs in the North and the South and the East and the West of this country continuously reinterpreted this language, relying on local understandings and state-level understandings that made legal segregation and continued legal segregation and disenfranchisement in the South, and de facto residential employment and every other kind of segregation and discrimination in the North. We saw that in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the Supreme Court decision, 7-1 vote, that established the separate but equal clause and said that it was perfectly fine for Louisiana to have separate but equal facilities. This continued, in fact, Plessy versus Ferguson has technically never been overturned, although people say in the legal profession say that it's de facto overturned because of so many rulings, most famously, of course, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that have
changed the interpretation of how we look at that original decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. But still, this is 1954, and as most of you probably know, the ruling in Brown didn't bring about desegregation. It took decades more of struggle in the civil rights movement, and at massive effort and with loss of life, to start to bring an end to segregation in practice. And of course, if you visit almost any major urban area in the United States today, you will find that de facto on the ground, separation of the races remains. It is not a problem that we seem to have been able to deal with yet. And that is an underlying reality, an undeniable underlying reality of the way we live in our country today. So since the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we have an end to explicit white supremacy as a system and the institutionalization of what is sometimes now called colorblind racism or colorblind white supremacy. This pattern continues to be used to, it continues to produce racial hierarchies through phenomena like mass incarceration, which disproportionately affects black folk in particular and people of color more generally, residential segregation through practices like redlining, the legacy of which has created vast disparities in wealth distribution, militarized policing of black neighborhoods, and now we have weaponized reactions to demographic change, which become a bridge to white nationalism, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. So just to summarize, white supremacy in the way I'm using it is not just a few people in hoods or with swastikas. It's the system of racialized social control that continues to exist in the United States. For most of the period since 1964, it has been officially defended in colorblind language. It has not gone away, but it has changed, adapting to legal, cultural, and demographic changes. All right, so how does that relate to white nationalism as a social movement? How is white nationalism different? I mean, I work with many people who look around at the problems facing folks who live in neighborhoods where there are food deserts, where there are high crime rates, where property values, where many properties stand vacant, and they're saying, why should we be concerned about a few kooks with guns? I mean, the state is doing a pretty good job, or our culture is doing a pretty good job of keeping people in their place. Shouldn't we be working on that? And I'm like, of course we have to keep working on justice. Justice is a project. I mean, Martin Luther King would say the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We like to go more with his actual practice, which is something more like the arc of history is long and it bends towards those who pull the hardest. I'm hoping that can be us. So white nationalism. White nationalism is a social movement. That means it's people organizing themselves to do something, in groups usually, to promulgate ideologies and ideas, to plot electioneering campaigns, to open media outlets, and in the extreme cases, to use violence. Some in the white nationalist movement contemplate overthrowing the government. But I have to say then a little bit about why. For the white nationalists, you see, for white supremacy, the system was adequate to keep white people in power. But white people, for white supremacy, became sort of with air quotes. It was flexible. White people meant whoever you needed to assimilate to whiteness, as long as they played the game. So you can have a black president. That's not a problem for white supremacy, as long as the system continues to function to keep people in their place. This is not going to work for white nationalists. White nationalist movement emerges after the end of Jim Crow, after the civil rights movement, when folks who had maybe previously stood up for that movement, I mean for white supremacy, and wanted to maintain Jim Crow, wanted to maintain segregation. White nationalists say, no, the problem is our biological essence as white people is being challenged by an influx of non-white immigrants, and we must protect our genetic essence. So where white rule was good enough for white supremacy, after all, I mean, for a long period of time, say Mississippi was a relatively small number of white folk, but they still ruled Mississippi. Not good enough for white nationalists. They want a supermajority of people who they will define as genetically white, as biologically, essentialistly white. And if needs be, they'll figure out ways to exclude people, either by not letting more come in, by encouraging the birth of more white babies, by discouraging the birth of babies of non-white folk, and ultimately, if necessary, through forcing them out of the country, ethnic cleansing, and in some cases, even a genocidal vision. So race becomes a biological essence for them, and the short form is that for white nationalists, there is just no other more important question. Emerging from the shadows of Jim Crow, they started to organize themselves as a whole bunch of new groups, new on the scene, and even reincarnating some old groups in new forms, like the fourth generation Ku Klux Klan, which becomes an organization that's not trying to roll back the clock to segregation, but to establish a white ethno-state. All right. So, in summary, the problem with white supremacy for white nationalists is that it is not racist enough. Okay? So, for us, white nationalism is not a euphemism. It's not a polite way to say white supremacist. White nationalists are white supremacists who want to add on top of white rule a basically pure white ethno-state by any means necessary. Okay. So, now, this would be the point where I would start telling some jokes, and it's just not appropriate at this because of the time. Because how is it, if you're a biological determinist and you think that people of color are genetically, biologically inferior with respect to intelligence and morality, that they have come to threaten white civilization? How is that possible? I mean, the short one-word answer is Jews. And this is an old answer. It is an answer that was familiar in the Nazi movement, that emerged from the racialization of old forms of anti-Semitic Christian theology in the strand known as successionism, and within it which was embedded the idea that Jews are devils who have supernatural powers, and that they are in this world to do the work of Satan in some passages of interpretation in Christian theology. In some versions of anti-Semitic theology, the children of the devil and here to do bad things. This became scientized during the racist movement in Europe in the 19th century. And so what had been a theological idea becomes converted into a genetic idea that says Jews are super parasites living on the host of Western civilization and constantly trying to undermine it through manipulation of the usual things, money and leaders and morality and propaganda and conspiracy. Specifically, what Jews are seen to be responsible for in the contemporary white nationalist movement is using immigration and people of color to undermine the white racial majority. So Jews are responsible for bringing, in the white nationalist imagination, for bringing Jews into this country, for bringing people of color, black and brown and Muslim of whatever color into this country in order to destroy white civilization. This is explicit. This is not an interpretation. In the extreme ends of white nationalism, like the manifesto recently published by the California shooter, like the Bowers Testament, like what the Charleston shooter had to say, what the Norway shooter had to say in their long statements, and in what the literature of white nationalism has always said. This is explicit. So you get groups like the Order, which is one of the first groups to sort of actualize in the United States this philosophy of white nationalism. This is a violent revolutionary organization that emerges from a sect of Christianity referred to as Christian identity, and ends up with murder, and this is the oath that they would swear. These are called the 14 words. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. This is so common that it's become a meme, mass-produced in white nationalist channels, and it's all over the net and all over the world as kind of a pledge to whiteness. The groups around the Order innovated the language that became known as the Zionist occupation government, which sort of was or Zog, which was the language which sort of operationalized this idea that Jews were controlling things behind the scenes. So from the very beginning then of white nationalism, which again emerges post-Jim Crow, post-civil rights movement, you have a overblown obsession with demographics. So here we see David Duke, 1977, on a Klan border watch, patrolling the US border the way we've heard about in recent days of vigilantes down on the border trying to catch and catching border crossers. Well, this was Duke, as was often the case. I mean, he's a horrible human being, but he was often ahead of the bigot curve. Fretting about white genocide, this idea of the demographic decline of whiteness. The other component of white nationalism that emerges specifically through its connections with anti-Semitism, where you see the strongest connections between the two, you end up with insurrectionary ideas. The idea that the whole government of the United States is so deeply corrupt because of its influence, it's being so deeply influenced by Jews or occupied thereby, that it has to be destroyed. In the Turner Diaries, of course, this is a novel written by William Pierce, who was a neo-Nazi and white nationalist, and very widely distributed in the movement, in the white nationalist movement. Ends up being a nuclear war where the nationalist movement, white nationalists, steal nukes, and they nuke basically any place that has a lot of Jews in them, New York and Israel and so on. And this is for them a good thing. And of course the Turner Diaries is fiction, but ever since the Turner Diaries, not flowing from it, but in sort of conversation with and reflection of it, we have this series of people who take this vision all too seriously. We have the Order in the mid-'80s, we have the Oklahoma City bomber in 1995, we have the shootings in Oslo, we have the Emmanuel American Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, we have Tree of Life just last year, we have the Christchurch shootings just so short a time ago that I haven't begun to recover yet. And then just this past weekend, we have the Poway, California shootings. And all of these cases explicitly justified by this notion of an overarching Jewish conspiracy to undermine white civilization and replace the white race with immigrants. And this then ties into a much broader, it links to a much broader ideology, much broader movement that has brought our current sitting president into office. That's not an exaggeration, and it's not to say that there's no difference between someone who picks up a gun and goes and shoots up a mosque or a synagogue and the president. There is a difference. For one thing, one of them is a billionaire. Alleged billionaire. In any case, this is, though, the point is that there are degrees, and in a social movement, it's like an ecology of groups and movements and ideas that interact with each other that don't necessarily cause each other directly. They have underlying similarities that we need to understand, and they interact with each other. So speech is tremendously important. I don't have time tonight to talk about what we call scripted violence, which in any depth, but it's the idea that when a particular message is put out into the world by someone in authority or by a social movement that is surging, that is becoming more and more popular, and when the ideas of that leader or that movement draw on deeply embedded prejudices that are common in popular culture, it leads a certain number of people to either organize into small groups or to take it upon themselves to commit acts of violence. This is absolutely predictable. It's true all over the world under these kinds of situations, especially when you have increased political polarization. It will happen. No one can tell you when or where, but it will happen. So the Great Replacement idea is grounded in census data, which tells us that the proportion of quote-unquote white people in the United States is going to change over the next 40 years, and that by 2060 we will have only about, 36.5% of the population will be quote-unquote white, meaning that the other groups, as defined, will constitute collectively a majority. This, of course, is happening already in some places. California is again ahead of this curve. Now, these projections, of course, are based on racial essentialism also. They don't really take into account that the number of people of mixed race, of people who will be counted in more than one way, is going to change over time, or that the categories themselves are unstable and will be redefined. That aside, for white nationalists, this is a catastrophe because of biological essentialism. For xenophobic nationalists, or this larger group of people who don't say biological race is everything, they make the same arguments without the biological references. They say, this is culture. The problem is the people who are coming now are unassimilable because of their differences in religion or background or their lack of commitment to American institutions. They recast the case from the language of racial essentialism to cultural determinism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart. It's a little bit too small for this size of audience, but it's meant to show that there's a movement ecology here. On the one end that says explicit racism, you have a group of actors in the explicit white nationalist field. The top half is people who are acting in the legal, political, above board arena, people who wear suits. And below we have people who are acting in the wild and woolly world of social movement violence, doxing, spreading hate memes, and ultimately bombs and guns. So above the line you have people like Jared Taylor of American Renaissance. You have Sam Francis, now deceased, but who was sort of one of the leading lights of white nationalist journalism, wrote for the Washington Times for a long time. Kevin McDonald, who's an evolutionary psychologist, who gives a modernization of anti-Semitic racial theory. And then you have in the middle people like Pat Buchanan, Peter Brimlow, Wayne Lutton, John Tanton. You've probably heard of maybe the first one or the first two, the second two not. The second two were the founders of the modern anti-immigrant movement, groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, over there on the left. So they act as bridges between explicit racism and coded racism. And when I say as bridges, I mean they were friends with, wrote for the journals of, went to conferences with those people over there on the far right. Okay. And the same kinds of phenomena down below the horizontal line in the realm of violence and bullying and doxing and hate memes. This is a more abstract version of that same model, where we have a much larger green xenophobic nationalism over on this side. I guess the color isn't too clear, but where it says xenophobic nationalism, you have coded cultural white nationalism. You have groups like FAIR, you have Breitbart is sort of the media center of this. You have the Tea Parties when they came up. You have the Trump and MAGA movement. You have the Islamophobic Act for America, and then you have more vigilante groups like the Minutemen Project in the 2000s, and now the constitutional militias. And then on the far right, you have the explicit white nationalists who I've already talked about, and you can see underneath the xenophobic nationalists, you tend to have a commonality of Islamophobia. On the white nationalists, you have a commonality of anti-Semitism and a great deal of overlap between the two. So I'm running out of time. I'm going to say a few words about community responses. Just our first idea that we push out into the world is seeking safety and solidarity. And this is an obvious thing to do when something terrible has happened. Here we have, following the murder of a Jewish security guard at a synagogue in Copenhagen in March 2015, you have people from all faiths coming together to stand at the synagogue. We say, think of the most vulnerable. Look around your world and ask who is the most visible, who is the most likely to come under attack. And that might not be the person who you personally agree with all the way. It's okay. No one deserves to be attacked by white nationalists. Maybe other white nationalists, but if they're not a white nationalist, solidarity, and look for the vulnerable. Sorry, I can't help it. Know it and name it. So when you see this, if it's in the media, if it's in your community, if it's at your school, if it's with your family, you don't have to be belligerent. See it and name it. You know, the whole business about securing our borders, people can make all kinds of arguments about this. People have various opinions about what should be done at the border. What shouldn't be done is justifying whatever it is that we do with white nationalist, anti-Semitic, or Islamophobic language, or with policies that are intrinsically xenophobic, indefinite detention, family separation, blanket denial of review of refugee status. So anything that comes from a group like Act for America, this is not something that you should tolerate. Here we have Close the Border Wall. This is coming from a white nationalist group, the American Identity Movement. You have the previous organization now talking about Sharia law. You know, in the fantasy world of white xenophobes and Islamophobes, the 1% of the population that is Muslim is about to impose Sharia law on the country. You can see the parallel with the thinking of the people who think that the Jews run the country. You have this thought leader, Jared Taylor, from American Renaissance. So, you know, just because it's dressed up as fancy academic language, it's still white nationalism. You have Gavin McInnes of the Proud Boys, who is over more on the xenophobic nationalist side, and, you know, his motto is, we're a Western chauvinist fraternity. Well, good for you. That's basically saying that you're a cultural determinist who believes in enforcing a monocultural society. That's hateful. We have media figures like Tucker Carlson, who endlessly repeats this stuff and who the white nationalists tell us in their media posts that they get a lot of their ideas from it. And of course, finally, we have the Make America Great Again movement, by no means all of whom are white nationalists, but all of whom are swimming in some pretty dirty water. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me here. Steve, thank you so much for that deeply profound and intellectual explanation. I'm going to offer kind of white nationalism light here by comparison to what Steve gave you. I wrote most of this talk several months ago, and it seems almost outdated now in some ways. I apologize for that. Hang with me till we get to the end. So, as Steve began by telling us and by reminding us, the news has become a never-ending cycle of reports of horrible events. If it's not Saturday's attack in California, it's a mass murder at a synagogue in Pittsburgh where my parents were married, or a mass murder in a mosque in New Zealand, which causes us to recoil and shudder. Violent white nationalists have moved from the back pages of history, front and center, onto the national and international stage. I want to talk with you for a few minutes about a case that I tried almost 30 years ago, the case of Sirah versus Metzger and the White Aryan Resistance. I bring the case up because recent events have unfortunately made the case relevant to our current troubled times. Mulugeta Sirah was 28 years old, thank you, one of approximately 200 Ethiopian immigrants who were living in Portland, Oregon in the late 1980s. The community was tight-knit, and those who knew Mulugeta described him as an intelligent, gentle, and kind young man. On November 13, 1988, a Saturday night, Mulugeta was leaning in the passenger window of a countryman's car on a quiet residential street on the east side of Portland. There was only one other car on the street. It was a silver and black Nissan moving slowly towards the Ethiopians. Inside the Nissan were three neo-Nazi skinheads and their girlfriends, members of a loose-knit group called East Side White Pride. As the Nissan approached Mulugeta and his friends, racial epithets poured out the window. The Nissan pulled alongside and the three skinheads jumped out in full attack mode. The assault was swift and deadly. Kyle Brewster, a former homecoming king at a Portland high school, held Mulugeta down, while another skinhead, a musician named Ken Miske, assaulted him from behind, swinging a Louisville Slugger bat, crushing Mulugeta's skull. The attackers then sped away, leaving Mulugeta in a pool of blood, never to regain consciousness. These assailants were racist skinheads who had been encouraged to commit acts of violence by a recruiter of an organization known as the White Aryan Resistance, or WAR. WAR was the brainchild of Tom Metzger, a former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, who was living in Southern California at the time. WAR, run by Tom Metzger and his son John, published a crude, racist, and anti-Semitic monthly newspaper and was recruiting skinheads to become the shock troops of the white supremacy movement. In the fall of 1988, WAR sent an agent, a young man named Dave Mazzella, to Portland. Mazzella was instructed by Metzger to recruit skinheads by going into public parks, finding people of color who were by themselves and attacking them. Miske and his colleagues were arrested within days of the murder. Mazzella was jailed, briefly released, went to Southern California, had a change of heart, turned himself into an office of the Anti-Defamation League, and shortly thereafter, the Southern Poverty Law Center was brought onto the case. I had it's a funny way to say it, good fortune, I guess as a lawyer I would say the good fortune, to be invited by the ADL and the SPLC to serve as local pro bono counsel and bring a lawsuit against the founders of the White Aryan Resistance and the White Aryan Resistance itself. Back then, and the case went to trial in 1990, a long time ago, I thought of Metzger as a little wannabe despot. It seemed to me back then that his views were so far out of the mainstream of American life as to be laughable. But as we have all learned in the last 2 years, my optimistic views of the mainstream were hopelessly naive. White nationalism and the concomitant belief in white supremacy are, as Steve has just pointed out to all of us, nothing new. They have been part of the fabric of America since our nation's inception. What is new is that for the first time since World War II, these views are seeping out from behind alleys and from under rocks and becoming normalized. It is my strongly held conviction that the only things that can keep these poisonous views in check, that can stop these views from taking over our country, and I'll come back to that, are the rule of law and the ballot box. Tom Metzger gave his own argument to the jury back in 1990. I reread it recently, and only then did I realize how frighteningly contemporary his argument was. He began by attacking lawyers, by referring to lawyers as a parasite class. He argued that America was changing for the worse, and that his vision of white nationalism was justified. He claimed that people who saw the world the same way he did were everywhere. He said, quote, "They are in your police departments, they are in your military, they are in your media, and there's more crops coming out all the time," close quote. Then he described what he saw as the problem. You'll find his rhetoric hauntingly familiar. Quote, "You're in the track of an invasion. When I moved to Fallbrook, California, I thought just like a lot of people here, oh, it couldn't happen here. We had a nice little community, and boy, we would always stay that way, and it was clean, and it was nice, and the schools were great, and they went over us like a steamroller, destroying our little town. We're being invaded from Mexico and everywhere in the South." He concluded by describing the plight of white Americans as he saw it. Quote, There is a growing underclass of white people in this country. They are dropping through the grating. They are becoming poorer and poorer and poorer, and they don't like what's happening in this country. When we won the case, when the jury awarded us millions of dollars, we thought we had put this kind of notion of white supremacy and white nationalism to rest. Boy, were we ever wrong. And I know that's not news to anyone sitting here. The spectacle of white nationalism and white supremacy were on full display in Charleston in 2015 when a 21-year-old man murdered 9 African Americans during a church prayer service. They're present in the frightening riots in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017, at the Tree of Life Synagogue last October, with the arrest in March of a U.S. Coast Guard lieutenant who planned a series of assassinations to further his goal of a white homeland, and with the horrific events in March at the 2 mosques in New Zealand, and with the attack in Poway just last weekend. But sadly, as terrifying as these events are, the reinvigoration of white nationalists and white supremacists is not limited to isolated events of violence. Rather, they are problems on a national scale. Because Metzger's odious views, the apocalyptic vision of America that he voiced in his closing argument that I shared with you, is a vision that white nationalists and nativists have embraced across Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and North America. Kathleen Ballou is an assistant professor of U.S. history at the University of Chicago. She has researched and written extensively on the white power movement. After the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, she wrote, "The Christian identity movement foretold an imminent end of the world in which believers would have to take up arms to clear the world of Jews, people of color, and other enemies before the return of Christ. In other words, it attempted to cast white power violence as a holy war. The historical archive shows us that events of mass violence motivated by the white power movement tend to be connected not only to one another, but to the more public-facing rhetoric and activism." So domestically, we now understand that Trump and many members of his administration share the views of avowed white nationalists. As a candidate, Trump attacked lawyers, he attacked the judiciary. He parroted Metzger's description of the Mexican steamroller. As a candidate, he spoke of the worsening economics of white Americans. As president, he has enlisted advisors who are avowed white nationalists. Just a year ago, his former confidant and White House advisor, Steve Bannon, publicly stated that being called a racist or a nativist should be considered a badge of honor. Step one politically for the white nationalists is the removal from the United States of non-white immigrants. Immigrants that the president considers to arrive at our borders from, as he put it, shithole countries. Those of us who have volunteered at ICE detention centers have observed, and you saw a slide that Steve put up, that the so-called detention centers are actually prisons, complete with guards and barbed wire. We have found the work neither glamorous nor encouraging. We have seen that almost all of the detainees are brown-skinned. Most are under the age of 30. Almost none of them have a criminal record. Every detainee I met during my volunteer stint had family in the U.S. willing to take them in. Every detainee I met was fleeing from violence in Central America. One young man told me of 3 relatives he witnessed being murdered by a drug gang. Another pulled up his shirt when I interviewed him to show me the bullet wound in his abdomen from a gang member. We all know overt racism based on perverse ideas of white supremacy when we see it. But what ICE detention center volunteers are encountering is different. It is institutionalized white nationalism. The concerted effort by our government to remove brown-skinned people from the country. Asylum seekers have international treaty rights that the United States has signed on to. American law guarantees these people due process hearings. What I experienced, however, was concerted institutional impediments to providing detainees meaningful legal proceedings to present legitimate claims of asylum. Legitimate claims of asylum guaranteed by treaties that our country has signed and ratified. And the noose is tightening. Last June, we all watched in disbelief as children were separated from their parents. But without as much publicity, it was quietly announced almost at the same time that the administration is instructing immigration judges to refuse asylum to women who fear being murdered by their husbands or to men and women who are fleeing from threats of forced labor on behalf of drug cartels. Just a few weeks ago, our new Attorney General issued an unprecedented and dehumanizing order instructing immigration judges to deny bond to persons with legitimate claims of asylum. And yesterday, President Trump ordered the Attorney General and the Homeland Security Secretary to require a fee be paid by people seeking asylum and a bar to such persons from getting work permits. Make no mistake what is happening right now in America. White nationalism is a growing political movement. It's not limited to these few violent, mentally deranged men who have been causing shooting incidents. There is a firm toehold in the executive branch of our government. It is manifest in the ICE detention centers. It is manifest in the immigration courts. It is manifest in decisions being made weekly in Washington, D.C., not only regarding immigration, but also in areas such as education and law enforcement. Although recent violence makes us justifiably nervous, requires us to have police cars and policemen at the front door of this peaceable assembly. But most of us believe that white nationalists can't take over our country. What is happening right now, we trust, is an aberration. Isn't that what most of us are thinking? Why do we believe this? Why are we confident that in 2020, an engineered crisis won't lead to the declaration of a national emergency and the postponement of federal elections? Or that an executive order based on a declared national emergency won't be declared requiring all voters to present passports or birth certificates in order to get a ballot, thereby ensuring the re-election of Trump? A trial balloon, in fact, was floated last August when Trump proposed that IDs be required in order to receive a ballot. Why do we continue to believe our democracy is not in jeopardy? Because we think it can't happen here. Because we think what happened in Germany and Italy, what happened in Argentina and Chile and Yugoslavia, what is happening right now in Hungary and Turkey and Colombia and Venezuela, that it can't happen here. We believe our government is better than those places. We believe Americans won't allow our institutions to cease functioning as a deterrent to those who would change the fundamental nature of our country. But are our beliefs true? Are we forgetting our history of the Native American genocide? Are we forgetting our history of slavery and Jim Crow? Are we forgetting that during World War II, the United States government denied entry visas to thousands of Jews fleeing Europe, while on the West Coast simultaneously imprisoning our Japanese American neighbors? are we ignoring the chilling statement Trump gave to Breitbart just 6 weeks ago, in which he implied the threat of violence as a substitute for the rule of law? For those of you who missed it, here is a direct quote from the President of the United States. Quote, "You know, the left plays a tougher game. It's very funny. I actually think that the people on the right are tougher, but they don't play it tougher, okay? I can tell you, I have the support of the police, the support of the military, the support of the bikers for Trump. I have the tough guys, but they don't play it tough until they get to a certain point. And then it would be very bad. Very bad." Close quote. From the President of the United States? White nationalism, disguised as populism, with its anti-black, anti-brown, anti-Asian, anti-Muslim, and anti-Semitic agendas, is part of the warp and woof of American culture. Which brings me back to Trump's attacks on the judiciary and the rule of law. You know, one of the redeeming threads that runs through American history, one of the things that makes our country different than just about every country in the world, is the public adherence to the rule of law. The public acceptance of court process and court judgments, and the court's reliance on the principle of stare decisis, and the recognition of the priority of constitutional rights. Although the courts have too often played along with concepts of white supremacy and white nationalism, since World War I, the justice system has saved us from our worst selves or eventually apologized for failing to do so. The end of Jim Crow, the recognition of freedom of choice and gay marriage, the belated acknowledgement that the Japanese internment was wrong, all have been the results of lawyers and judges adhering to the rule of law. And although there have been threats from time to time to ignore court rulings, Americans, with the most isolated of exceptions, have not attempted armed rebellion against the judicial department. There are three worlds coexisting on earth: one world of disorder and two worlds of order. There are large numbers of people who live in our world with no rule of law whatsoever, a world where the only order is enforced with bullets and bombs. Portions of Africa, portions of Central America have no effective governments and no rule of law whatsoever. And there are two worlds of order: the rule of power worlds and the rule of law worlds. In the rule of power worlds, there are lofty legal principles set forth in the documents of government, but there is no semblance of justice, no rule of law. The citizens live their lives only as tolerated by the governments. Ask the jailed enemies of Vladimir Putin. The Russian Constitution guarantees citizens the same rights American citizens enjoy in language equally encompassing and grandiose. But there was not, there still is not, an independent legal system where Russians can effectively exercise their rights. Ask the citizens of Cuba, who cannot hire a private lawyer if the state charges them with a crime, because there are no private lawyers in Cuba, and the lawyer they are assigned has sworn to uphold the Cuban Revolution. Ask the citizens of China, where lawyers who champion the rule of law are simply imprisoned if they champion it too loudly. And incredibly, we are now faced with a president who disdains the rule of law and a Republican Party that in the last 2 years has been all too willing to go along. After Justice Scalia died, the Republican-controlled Senate snubbed its nose at 200 years of American history and the rule of law by refusing to even consider President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the U.S. Supreme Court. The constitutional duty of advice and consent was simply ignored. Candidate Trump openly attacked the judiciary, questioning the right of a judge with a Hispanic surname to decide a case in which he was a party. Candidate Trump openly called for the jailing of the Democratic Party's nominee for president. One of his first actions after election was to attempt to ban Muslims from entering the United States. As president, he fired the FBI director who would not pledge personal loyalty then demanded and eventually got the resignation of the Attorney General who dared to recuse himself from the Mueller investigation. And as president, he continues to call for the jailing of Hillary Clinton. As president, earlier this month, at the same time Trump was tweeting about actually closing our southern border, he made this absolutely astounding statement. Quote, "Congress has to meet quickly and make a deal. I could do it in 45 minutes. We need to get rid of chain migration. We need to get rid of catch and release and visa lottery, and we have to do something about asylum. And to be honest with you, we have to get rid of the judges." Make no mistake about what the meaning is of what I just read to you. The President of the United States of America does not believe in the rule of law, the foundational legal principle that has allowed our nation to flourish. What I have learned from 46 years of practicing law is that most of the rights important to us, most of the rights important to American-style democracy, most of the rights we all consider inalienable, are primarily protected through the application of the Bill of Rights. But rights on a piece of paper mean nothing by themselves. I'm Jewish. My maternal grandparents fled from Russia to escape persecution. My father managed to leave Germany just before World War II. Perhaps because of my family history, democracy seems more fragile to me than to most folks. But I am more than concerned. I am frightened by what is going on in our country. We must sensitize ourselves to recognize how any group of citizens' loss of fundamental rights jeopardizes all of our rights. If Muslims become second-class citizens, a bright line of constitutional protection will have been crossed. If brown-skinned immigrants are denied their rights of due process, none of us should feel safe. It can happen here. We are no better than any other group of people on any other piece of real estate in the world. The accretion of dangerous power, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Frankfurter has warned us, does not come in a day. It does come, however slowly, from the generative force of unchecked disregard of the restrictions that fence in even the most disinterested assertion of authority. Throughout the entire history of the United States, from John Adams here in Boston defending British soldiers charged with murder in 1770, to the present-day lawyers who sued to block Trump's travel ban on Muslim immigrants, the legal profession and our nation's adherence to the rule of law has been acting as an unofficial check and balance on government misconduct, providing individuals with their ability to secure their basic rights. As concerned citizens, we must do what we can to cleanse the halls of power of white nationalists. We must contribute money to the opponents of white nationalists. We must work at home and in neighboring states where we're needed to defeat the wielders of dark power. A word to my Jewish friends and colleagues who say that Trump's support of Israel overrides his odious support of white nationalism. I respectfully say to you, who feel this way, take stock of what America has provided the Jewish community and appreciate that the dismantling of our democracy and our rule of law will unleash anti-Semitism on an unimaginable scale. I am proud to be associated with the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization founded on legal resistance to white nationalism and white supremacy, an organization that is fighting tooth and nail every day of the week to preserve the rule of law. There is a political sea change and a sense of violence in the air. It is a potentially dangerous time. What has happened elsewhere can happen here when democratic values are overwhelmed by misguided leaders. We must hold our nation fast to the rule of law. as it is our primary protection against the darkness looming on the horizon. Thank you.
So, thank you very much to our speakers. It's now question time. You can stand up to the mic. Since we have a lot of people, I would ask that you be respectful of their time. I will remind you that there's literature about the sponsoring informations, the Southern Poverty Law Center, I think the ADL, and Political Research Associates on those tables. And we will be passing baskets around to collect money, as you heard Eldon say very eloquently. They could use some money. So can Political Research Associates. All the money collected will be shared between them. Cash will be distributed equally between these organizations. Checks can be made out to the Southern Poverty Law Center or to Political Research Associates. They are both tax-deductible organizations.
Hi, I'd like to ask the second speaker to comment on the recent indictment of a state judge in Massachusetts for protecting an immigrant.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm sorry. I just don't know about it.
Okay, I'll just say to the audience and then I'll leave. A judge in Massachusetts took an action to prevent ICE from capturing somebody who was in court custody, and the result was that the U.S. Attorney for the district has indicted the state court judge. And that seems to somehow relate to what we just talked about, the rule of law.
Yeah, I would think so. I don't know anything about it. I wish I could comment on it. I don't know anything about it. Do you know anything about it?
No more than what you've just said. I mean, I've read of the case. From what I read, the action in question was basically sending the person out the back door of their courtroom, which by legal tradition, the judge has purview over their own courtroom, and the idea that that person should be indicted for that action for non-cooperation with ICE enforcement is it's appalling in terms of what it says about the priorities of certain sections of the Justice Department at the moment.
Hi, thank you guys both for coming. I think that your talks are all taken together. It was really interesting to hear them back to back. I have a question coming out of that, which is that I really appreciated the conversation about white supremacy as a system, and how white supremacy is really intrinsic to law in the United States. So I was kind of curious, coming off of that, about your response to second speaker, as how our first line of defense should be the rule of law in the ballot box. So my question is, if intrinsic to the rule of law itself, how do you fix or address the problem of white supremacy with the tools that were used to build and uphold the very problem in the first place?
The legal system is not perfect. The legal system, however, in the United States is such that it has allowed this country to become what it is. There would be no United States of America as we know it without the rule of law. Has the rule of law been misused by elected officials, by legislators throughout our history? Absolutely. Which is why I don't say anything without linking it to the ballot box. We must insist that the people that run for office and that the people we support accept the principles of democracy and equality. And if we don't insist upon it, then the rule of law will fail.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a little nervous about speaking, but I just have to jump up and question something.
I keep feeling like, we talked about the ballot box and we're going to have this election, and Trump's old fixer, Michael Cohen, said something that really jammed in my mind and I have been feeling for a long time, which was that you're not going to, I don't remember when he said it or how he said it, but you're not, what makes you think you're going to get in that office? And I think about the ballot box and how machines or whatever, how is there any way we can make sure that we actually can vote?
What we need to do as individuals and as groups is participate heavily in the next election cycle. We need to go to different states and be poll watchers. We need to work in the grassroots. It is up to us to stop this, and we can only stop it if we're active. We can't leave it up to the people in other states. You live as do I, in a wonderfully liberal state, in a progressive state. I need to go to Nevada and Montana and Idaho and do something to help those folks there. And I think you folks in Massachusetts need to go to your neighboring states and help them there.
Just to follow on that, just a little, at the end of his talk, Eldon was referencing the ways in which, in fact, our institutions are like the institutions of all complicated societies and all democratic societies are fragile. And disengagement with those institutions, however tempting, and I would go further than to say, I would actually say that our justice system and legal system is not just imperfect, I would say it's deeply flawed. That just means it needs our help more. And yeah, it's not just a question of voting or giving money to candidates, it's volunteering for those election watch committees. It's becoming involved with precinct level activities. Stuff that frankly doesn't feel like it's big picture stuff. But if we're not acting at that level, we're going to miss the trees trying to see the forest. And in terms of the institutions being fragile, that's all of them. That's the legal system. That's the way education is working. That's the way city governments are working. Some places are doing okay. Other places, like where I'm from, I live currently, my home office is here in Somerville, but I work from Kentucky. And in Kentucky, we have tremendous problems. Without the involvement of citizens and the effort to include everyone in that work, we're going to end up in a situation of chronic mistrust, which becomes a vicious cycle. I spent some time living and teaching in Pakistan, and one of the biggest problems that exists in Pakistan is chronic mistrust of institutions. The government can try to do all sorts of things, the state can try to do all sorts of things, and no one will comply because they assume the system is corrupt, often with good reason. Well, if we start with the presumption of corruption and disavow our own power because we're not willing to take risks, particularly those of us with privilege, then we're guaranteeing the further slide or rush towards xenophobic nationalism, white nationalism, theocratic nationalism, some version thereof that none of us are going to like very much, even many of the people who are currently seem to be content with the direction.
It's okay, I can see you.
I'm curious how easy it has been for the white nationalist movement to recruit today's young people, and whether the current young generation breaks disproportionately towards inclusion, and finally whether that is any reason to give us hope that time is on our side and that the age is not going to realize that.
You want to take that one?
we talked about this actually back during, I actually got my start doing this kind of work around the same case that Eldon worked on in Portland. I'm originally from Portland and worked with a group that came to be after the murder of Mulugeta Sarah by neo-Nazi skinheads. And the word was, well, don't worry too much about the skinheads, they will age out of their bigotry. And you know what? If you mean they will age out of wearing Doc Martens and going to disrupt punk concerts, that's probably true. But the spread of the ideology, the ideas of white nationalism have grown up. Sometimes when I do these presentations, I show the sort of more scholarly versions, the American Renaissance of Jared Taylor in his suit standing up and making these speeches. Jared Taylor, who's a former banker and very well spoken with kind of a quasi-fake English accent. And actually his family's from Kentucky. But when he talks, he sounds like someone you should be listening to. He doesn't sound like Tom Metzger ranting and raving. The movement, the white nationalist movement, has spread out and diversified. And when you get over into the xenophobic nationalists where there's not the explicit biological determinism, it's even attractive now to some young people of color who are citizens and want to keep out people who might want to come.
And then, of course, the other thing that's so frightening right now, really, is how the internet has made this kind of, I don't even know what to call it. What would you call the junk on 8chan? I mean, what would you call it?
Nihilistic trolling culture is what my colleague, who's an anthropologist who does work on this, but this idea of unending cynicism about everything and the use of the most explicit and outrageous ideas that you can get your hands on, and sort of divided into various factions on the chans, and a culture also of explicitly trying to hurt people. I mean, to use words and ideas to hurt people. I mean,
the shooter in Charlotte, the shooter in Christchurch, the shooter in Pittsburgh, the shooter in California, they're all quoting the same internet memes. It's frightening. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. So how do we, so this other person just talked about young people, and it's my belief that you can reach people at different times, you know, and that we need to figure out how to go towards people that we might disagree with. And I just want to know, like, not, I mean, we always just your thoughts about political fighting as hard as we can. Politically is so important. But I want to know also, how do you have the alliance, how do you build alliance with people who may not be ready to fight yet, but could be won over to the way that we think about this?
I think that these ideas that Steve so eloquently laid out for us in his talk cannot survive sunlight. And I think it's simply, I think it's sunlight. I think the ideas are stupid and they need to be dealt with by talking about their illogic.
I think that's part of the answer, and the other part of it is if you're going to reach out to people who you think might be nervous about the coalition, the first step is to reach out to them, to ask. I mean, what I found doing this work, for example, back in Portland, is that if you try to find common ground without jettisoning or putting at risk the most vulnerable. That's the thing you have to keep in mind. You can bring anyone in to talk, But you have to understand that if you're going to negotiate, you have to keep in mind who is most vulnerable. But I found that a vast range of groups would be willing to sign on when it comes to action against explicit white nationalism. Take that. Maybe they won't sign on for denouncing the president or some of his red hat wearing followers as explicit white nationalists. Maybe they won't go that far. Take what you can get. Reach people where you can reach them. If you don't reach out, you won't know. And this is most true, of course, at the national level, organizations have hardened mission statements. But locally, that's your neighbor. Invite them over for coffee.
I have a very tangible answer to the gentleman that asked about the Newton judge, and I have to full disclosure say that I'm a distant cousin of Elvin's and a law school classmate, and I'm here all the way from Brookline. But the answer that I want to give, I can answer questions about the case, but there is a GoFundMe account for the judge, and her legal expenses will be well into 6 figures. So I would urge people, her name is Shelley Joseph, you can find it in the media, etc. And I would urge people to go there and give a contribution. A lot of people have been contributing just in the last 4 days. The legal organized bar has really rallied to their support, and even the Globe, which doesn't always go in this direction, did a very good editorial today. So I don't have any other questions. I'll ask Elvin later when we get together. I hope.
My question is, what's the connection between, say, the white nationalism movement here and the right-wing proto-fascist movement going on in Europe?
In where?
In Europe, Hungary.
They're all connected. They meet together, they talk together, they write together, they think together. It's one and the same, right?
They're deeply connected. This is something that has evolved over the last 30 years, but they invite each other to each other's conferences. They read the same online materials. They publish each other's stuff. So even though each country may have some things that are unique to them, every version of this, not just because of there's differences in the ideas, but there's differences in the hometown institutions. So working in Hungary is going to be different than working even in Germany or in Britain or the US. But yes, these movements are deeply connected to each other, especially in Europe, increasing connections to authoritarian movements, other parts of the world as well, even where the dynamics around white nationalism become transformed into ethnic nationalism.
Hi, thank you. Speaking of the role of law here, I don't know if that's like privilege that you want to talk about, but I'm curious about what you think about potential impeachment of Trump, and whether that would be a good thing for us to pursue or a terrible thing for us to pursue.
That's a political decision. I mean, that is a totally political decision. It's not a legal decision. Trump's going to get indicted if he loses the election in 2020. I'm convinced of that, by the Southern District of New York. I mean, that's what every indication is. I really think that is not where we should be putting our energy now, unless we're senators or congressmen. I think we should be putting our energy into the next election cycle.
What do you say?
And we've never met before.
Well, I wanted to add one more dark thing to the dark session we're having here. I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is really the faith in the election process, because right now, and actually this has been going on for a long time, there's been a very concerted effort to design And in fact, this week, one of the things that was really interesting was people woke up in Florida and realized that all of these felons were going to get to vote again. And they said, oh my God, what can we do about it? And they said, well, we'll put all sorts of obstacles, make them pay back all sorts of fines, whatever we can. And so the inventiveness and the ability to try to disenfranchise as many people as possible is a ongoing strategy. So I guess I wanted to ask about that because I think that we should be really wary of this, all of the tactics that are out there that are trying to steal and destroy our democracy.
If you don't know what he's talking about, in Florida, in the 2018 elections, a coalition of progressive groups, including the Southern Poverty Law Center as one of the leading groups, got a ballot measure in Florida, got a measure on the ballot in Florida to return the franchise to convicted criminals who have completed their sentences. And it passed easily. And then the Florida legislature came back a couple weeks ago, and I don't know whether the bill's been signed into law or not, but it was passed that no, we're not going to really do that unless they pay all outstanding fines and penalties that were assessed in their criminal case. Well, that's great. Somebody just got out of prison for 5 years, and they were given a $5,000 fine before they were in prison, and now you're not going to let them vote until they can pay off that fine when they come out of prison totally broke. I mean, it's so clearly voter suppression that it doesn't even come close to passing the smell test. It's 10 to 9. That's fine. Okay, 5 more minutes.
Obviously, we could talk on some of these subjects all night. I mean, you know, the voter suppression issues, and then, of course, you know, the ways in which gerrymandering has been used to redraw districts in ways that preserve the majority of the party in power. If you talk about the ways in which apportionment happens for representatives, you have often the case where people who are arrested and tried in one jurisdiction are actually imprisoned in another jurisdiction, in another precinct, another voting area, where they are counted as part of that population, but can't vote there, of course, because they're in prison. I mean, so this is like the reincarnation of the 3/5 compromise. So there are endless things to be vigilant about, and there are many of these points that are part of systemic white supremacy that we can't stop fighting for just because we're trying to stop social movement white nationalism, which, as Eldon pointed out in his talk, and which I didn't quite get to talk about, but thank you for pointing it out, is that what's happening on the border right now and with immigration law is in fact the institutionalization of white nationalist ideas beyond existing colorblind white supremacy.
Very well. Well, thank you both for being here. Nice to see everyone. And I appreciate the conversation. Attentional later to remember all of that. I want to also read and look at the everyone and I'm a couple years away from getting a PhD in global health. And I'm being a little bit about exactly mechanisms like psychology and stuff like that. And I imagine that it could be helpful for me to become some sort of curriculum to teach really good young kids, or at any age, basics of human functioning, psychology-wise, but definitely not one of the secrets, falseness, all of that. And I'm wondering from your perspective, systemically, coming into the education system, like, tend to try, like, internationally, right, the things in the globe, to build more resistance and benefits of things in like Massachusetts. So I thought about starting in Massachusetts
what I will say here is, I mean, this is not, this is not an area where I'm an expert, but what I do know is you don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are a number of organizations that, in fact, are already designing and, to a certain extent, moving out into the world curricula for young children in the United States. And I can't think of their names off the top of my head, but if you...
One of them is Teaching Tolerance that the Southern Poverty Law Center sponsors. You should try to take a look at their materials.
Yeah, and so that's where I would start teaching tolerance and look at some of the other programs that are doubtless quoted therein and see where you might like to go with it. I mean, you start with what's happening now and see if there's something you want to do differently. Again, approach and say, look, I have this idea. Yeah. Thank you.
This is more of like a theoretical, perspective, but I think a lot of the time we discuss anti-Semitism, we make assumptions about what's going on. We dealt with forms of oppression, and in the first talk you mentioned the sort of Jewish conspiracy theory of being an intermediary between the ruling classes and oppressed groups. And those are two more Jewish experience into existing categories of white and non-white and really not accurate. And I just was curious if you could maybe try to differentiate between sort of anti-black racism and anti-Semitic. That's a broad question, but I think that's the point.
I can give you my, this of course is something I do an entire talk about. This is something I do an entire talk about, but I mean, so yes, I mean, the position that you're talking about is referred to as middle agent theory. And what it basically says is that because of certain historical contingencies, what anti-Semitism looks like to those who are acting on it is what we refer to colloquially as punching up. In other words, the target is imagined not as being inferior, but as being superior, as part of a connected to controlling or in some ways conspiring to use power as it exists to hurt the majority population, be that white or be that Christian or be that white and Christian. That is the way that has been historically constructed. There are all sorts of nuances to this that we could spend, again, 3 hours on, but yeah.
Also, where are you from? I just moved from Louisville. So.
I'm in Louisville.
All right, last question, then we have to leave.
Thank you both for the evening and what to think about. I have two concerns. One is I don't doubt the connection between a lot of what's happening on the right and xenophobia and Islam, ideology and racism. But I sort of feel that there's more anti-Semitism arising on the left. I think the conflation of Jews is real and language that generates makes it clear that there's a specific flavor. So I don't think there's enough xenophobia on the left around necessarily black people, or there's anti-Islamophobia too. But today's topic was skewing towards xenophobia and I'm worried that it's not that's one thing. And the other thing is just a practical thing that recommendation for someone I appreciate, but as a practicing doctor, I'm very careful about legal research and things that don't know, and you don't usually see people that are alcoholic, because people don't identify like that. I think so sometimes I find it helpful to identify language that is inflammatory without identifying it necessarily
On the second point, I think careful, well, actually on both points, careful language is crucial. Of course, when I'm talking about, in this presentation, when I'm talking about white nationalists, I'm predominantly talking about people who make no bones about calling themselves white nationalists. They're quite open about it, and their goals are out there in the public sphere, because for them, what they're facing is dystopian end of whiteness, and they see that as the ultimate bad thing that could possibly happen in the universe, justifying almost any response. Again, left anti-Semitism is a potentially big topic. I don't know how much I want to say about it at the moment, because if I give you 20 seconds, it doesn't really do justice to the nuances. The one thing I will say is that when I was in the middle of a meeting at Berkeley last week, a conference on right-wing studies, and we heard about the shootings outside of San Diego at a synagogue, there was no one in the room who thought leftists did this. There's a difference. There is left anti-Semitism, but at least in the American context, it does not come from the tradition of metaphysical anti-Semitism that drives genocidal impulses.
Thank you so much. We've been asked to exit the premises, so thanks again.
I would like to thank once again, to thank our wonderful